Welcome back to The Meaning of Men, the show dedicated to helping men find meaning, purpose, and resilience in their lives. I'm your host, Simeon Atkins, and today we're exploring the power of identity, creativity, and acceptance with poet and author Dean Atta. Dean opens up about his childhood growing up in a mixed-race, single-parent family and the role writing played in helping him process emotions and claiming his identity. He shares candidly about his journey of coming out as gay and the challenges of navigating the stigma he experienced. We also examine masculinity, how it's often reduced to stereotypes of strength and toughness, and what it really means to embrace vulnerability, creativity, and authenticity as forms of power. Let's get into it. Dean, what do you hope people take away from our conversation today?
I would hope they take away a sense of openness, us being open with one another, and their lives being open to new possibilities. Because I think through writing, I've found myself opening up to people, opening up to the truths about myself, opening up to the possibilities for my life, and not feeling limited in people's expectations of me or my own expectations of myself. Like there's so many things I didn't know I could do or would do in this life. And so I'm keeping an open mind and an open heart, and I hope our listeners do the same.
What do I need to know about you and particularly your early days to help me understand the person that's sitting in front of me today?
I grew up in London, which is a great place, very diverse, and has kind of particular things about it that, you know, is a London life. So I grew up in a single parent family as well, a mixed race. My mum is from Cyprus and my dad's from Jamaica. And I should clarify, my mum's family is from Cyprus and my dad's family are from Jamaica because, you know, both my parents were born here. And so those identities are identities I've kind of had to claim and understand for myself through my family, but also through making friends and traveling to those countries as well. I'm a writer. I write poetry, fiction and non-fiction, and I write for all ages. But I started out as a teenager writing for myself and writing my thoughts and feelings and things that made me angry and things that made me sad. I'm very open in my writing about my own life. I use a lot of my own experiences, even in my fiction writing. So, yeah, and I think from a young age, I was interested in performing. I did a lot of musical theatre when I was a kid. I went to a Saturday drama school called Sylvia Young's, and that was really great. And I got lots of good opportunities from that. I performed in musical theatre. I performed in Oliver in the West End and Bugsy Malone in the West End. I met Michael Jackson once. I sang on Songs of Praise. I'm Christian or raised Christian. That's something that's important to know about me. And yeah, I'm gay. And if I didn't mention that yet. But that's, yeah, it's interesting. I said that almost last, only because there's so many things about me that I think are more interesting than my sexuality, but sometimes other people foreground your sexuality before anything else. So for me, it quite obviously isn't the most important thing, but it is something worth mentioning.
Yeah, we're going to dive into identity because I think it's very interesting because there are so many different facets and people will place more importance on certain things than others when it comes to this sense of identity. I'm actually really keen to get a little bit more insight into this idea of claiming your identity from your parents' background as well. And we'll certainly dive into that. And I love this idea of really exploring openness because it's actually something that I'm currently going through in my own journey at the moment as well. And it's something that's definitely helping, starting to write down how I'm feeling and processing things that way, because it's so easy for things to get stuck and muddled in your head, and trying to process it that way can be very difficult. But as soon as you start to put it down on some paper, that can actually be a nice first step before maybe sitting down with someone. One of the big areas that shaped you when you were younger was your experience of coming out and being open about your sexuality. I'd love to revisit that experience and explore what you went through and ultimately how it played out.
Yeah, so I have a few versions of my coming out story. Not that they're not all true, but it's just like what you emphasize. And so for me, I sometimes say, it wasn't a big deal. Like there was a boy I fancied in my drama class when I was 15, and I asked him out. He said no, but then everyone now knew that I was gay. And that is part of the truth. But alongside that, there was the checking with the school chaplain whether I would go to hell for being gay, like having that conversation before coming out. There was the praying on my own about it and worrying about it. There was all the years before where I tried to act like the other boys, not act straight, but feign an interest in football and laugh along when they told me XYZ girl fancied me, because I had lots of female friends, and I think the girls maybe had a suspicion I was gay and they were very comfortable with me. I'd had a couple of girlfriends, but things never went very far, and it was it was just nice companionship, really. And so I kind of knew I was gay and I was torn about it, because I also knew I got on really well with girls, and as long as sex wasn't going to happen, I'd be okay to have a girlfriend. But as you get to 15, people start getting quite horny and girls proposition you. Like, it was wild. And so I felt like if I was going to go there, it would be with a boy, my age. And I wanted that experience. Like everyone else was hooking up, I wanted a boyfriend. And so there was one boy who was in my drama class, and he was slightly alternative, and I mistook that for being gay, and asked him out, and he said no, and he actually had a girlfriend at a different school, or so he says, and I don't know, but I played it off as I was cool with it, but underneath, I was quite torn and tortured about doing that, but I didn't see myself having another option. I wasn't going to wait till university and just stay in the closet for another 3 years. Like, that just felt like a non-starter. That couldn't happen. I had to come out, and and it didn't result in me getting a boyfriend, but it resulted in me having a more whole sense of myself at school. And there was only a couple of boys, one really, and then his follower, that kind of tried to make me feel bad, and he used to whisper in the back of class, like, so whenever we were in a class together, he'd be like, gay, gay. He'd just whisper the word gay. And because he was all the way at the back and I was somewhere in the middle, it never reached the teacher, or if it did, they didn't acknowledge it. And none of my classmates acknowledged it. So I chose to ignore it. And it was like, I thought it was water off a duck's back. And I just, brushed it off until one day I was in the kitchen after dinner, washing the dishes, and my mum came in and just asked me why I was crying, and I didn't realize I was crying. Like, I didn't know, and I kind of just took my gloves off and felt my face, and I was like, then started telling her, this boy at school keeps saying gay in the back of class to me, and she's like, well, if you're not, you can just ignore it. And I was like, but I am, mommy, but I am. And I fell to the floor crying. And she got down on the floor with me and stroked my back and told me it was okay. But then, when I kind of stopped crying, she was like, but you've got to be careful. You've got to use condoms. You don't want to get HIV. And that really was the kicker, because that really stayed with me. Like, and when I did become sexually active, like, that was like a huge concern, but also a huge kind of, I don't know, it became like the kind of main motif of my sex life in my like late teens and early 20s, was this kind of like, will I, won't I get HIV? Like, and I think that's the hang up from the 80s, which my mum saw, and it it was important advice to give me, but not at the moment of coming out. I really found it really upsetting, to be honest. And my mum wanted that to go in the memoir. When I was writing about my coming out experience, I kind of gave the briefer version that I gave at the start there. And she was like, that's not the full story. You want to tell everything. And, I don't mind if, how I look, she said. So, my mum was very open to the fact that I write quite, warts and all accounts of my childhood in my memoir, because I think, none of us pretend to be perfect, not me, not my mum, and I think that's really important, that we are learning as we're going. Really, she'd never had a gay son before, she'd never had a son before, so she had to figure that out. And my coming out was just one moment, in a long childhood where she did amazingly by me. And I think even that, I've got friends that came out, got kicked out of home, instantly. And so for me, I think that was kind of like a relief that, we were okay with me being gay. My mum was okay, and because she was okay, I was okay. And, my friends were okay. And this one boy and his follower weren't going to counteract all the positivity and all the support I had. And, when I did eventually mention it to some friends at school, like I had one of the toughest boys in my year was like, do you want me to sort him out? So I think when I was keeping it to myself was when I was the most tortured about it. As soon as I started talking about it, it became easier and easier. And I think that is true in lots of cases, in lots of parts of my life. When you start talking about it, that people want to support and help. And that's kind of what I found over and over again with any difficult decision or challenge I've faced in my life.
It just feels like, from the outside looking in, and from how you've told the story up until now, from the fact that it wasn't necessarily like a massive part of your memoirs at the start when we were talking about who you were, you didn't mention your sexuality until quite late on. It feels like it's not been the defining moment for you, or how you kind of like see and identify yourself. Do you think that's partly because of the fact that it was pretty well accepted by your mum and your close friends? Do you think if you hadn't have necessarily had that support element, it might have been slightly different in terms of like how you felt about it?
Yes, I mean, if I didn't have the support, I guess I may have found support through other avenues. We have, lots of great charities and organizations that support LGBT people, and I've volunteered as an adult for an LGBT youth group for a number of years, and I'm I'm a patron of LGBT plus History Month, and I'm going to be mentoring someone through an LGBT charity called Just Like Us. There are lots of organizations now where there's a lot of support for LGBT people of all ages. When I was younger, there were, even then, there were the charities. There was the Gay and Lesbian Switchboard. There was that you could call and get advice from a volunteer that was trained to kind of like talk to you and give you advice and guidance. And so I think I would have found some support, but I definitely am grateful that I didn't have to look too far for support. It was right there in my home, and it was right there at school and in my wider family as well. And but I think there are lots of LGBT people that find support and find family. If they're rejected by their birth family, there's this concept of chosen family, where you can choose the people who will be like your parent figure or your siblings. And I think that's a beautiful thing that we have in many communities, but I think I've noticed it the most in the LGBT community, and I've written about it to some extent in some of my books as well. But no, I'm kind of comforted to see that there is a lot of support out there. And in the back of my books, I kind of list different support groups, because sometimes you don't know until you know. Like, we think, oh, you can just get on the internet and search, but that can be quite daunting. So I like to put in print some of the support groups that I would kind of vouch for when when people pick up my books and they want to know more, because you never know what someone's first, gay awakening or first kind of like looking for information will be. And maybe for some people, it might be one of my books. So I like to signal and signpost other places they can get further information, further support in the back of my books as well. But I think overwhelmingly, I've found the LGBT community, and especially the Black LGBT community, has really, really supported me at every turn with everything I've turned my hand to, every time I've needed support, encouragement. Like, people come out and it feels really great because it's an extension of family for me now. That's how I see it. So many aunts and uncles, and unfortunately I'm at the age that I'm the uncle figure now. Uncle Dean. Not unfortunately, fortunately.
You've come full circle.
Yeah.
One of the key elements to this podcast is helping to expand this idea of what it means to be a man, particularly like the very sort of like rigid, narrow view of that. And tied closely, but not exclusively to that, I think is this idea of masculinity and what masculinity looks like. I'd love to get from you what you think masculinity is all about, and maybe where some of the myths, misconceptions, outright lies come when we're talking about masculinity and queerness.
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, I used to think this was a really good thing. Like, when I came out, I could stop pretending to be interested in football, and I could stop, pretending to be macho. But actually, that's a kind of misnomer, because there are, gay men interested in football, and there are gay men who are quite macho. And, unfortunately, then those guys get labeled straight acting, as if they're being something other than themselves, that they're acting straight. I think sometimes we may want to pass for straight to feel safe in some environments. When I visited Jamaica, on both occasions I've been there, I become a less vibrant version of myself. Let's put it that way. Like, I kind of restrict my body language. I don't move my hands as much. I don't sway my hips as much. I walk slower. I kind of look around slower. I talk slower or less. And that got me a label of shy guy amongst people we would spend time with in Jamaica, because people thought I was shy, and I'm not shy. But when I don't feel safe, I'm not going to chat as much, and I'm not going to be as open. And that for me was interesting, because I wasn't trying to be more masculine, but I was definitely repressing some of my kind of flamboyant nature. And that was really sad, and when I reflect on my time in Jamaica, I feel bereft sometimes that I need to go back and be with queer people, like, because they are there in abundance. But in the UK, I think we're having a huge conversation about masculinity with the TV show Adolescence that's come out. And I think there's even a conversation in episode 3 where the psychologist asks the boy what masculinity is, and she's like, oh, football and going to the pub, is it this, is it that? And honestly, those were some of the typical things I did associate with masculinity. My granddad used to go to the betting shop and be around all men placing bets, and I used to stand outside or have to go and get him when it was time for dinner. I had some members of my family that were a bit more kind of into fighting and wrestling, and even when we were really young, like, one of my cousins, the main way we would kind of interact was wrestling, and I used to love watching wrestling, but when we were doing it, it felt a bit overwhelming, because I was just like, I want to just play with my Barbie dolls or play video games, but I definitely don't want to have to prove my physical prowess to anyone. And I had friends at school who were really into football, and one in particular who wanted to get me to bench press with him and build up my muscles, because he knew I was into performing, and he thought, if you're going to be a famous actor, you're going to need to be ripped. You want to be the leading man, you need a six-pack. And that was something my mum even said to me when we'd go to Cyprus and go to the beach. She'd be like, I don't think you'd have to do too much to get a six-pack. Like, maybe you should do some sit-ups. And I was like, I have no interest in having a six-pack. And I see masculinity, I think I had a big conversation about this with Jordan Stevens, the actor and pop star. He did the narration for a short film that's been made of one of my poems, Two Black Boys in Paradise. And we were in Abbey Road Studios recording the voiceover that he did. And he stopped on a line in the poem, which is, masculinity has not been required of them. And that's referring to the two black boys in the poem. And he was like, what does masculinity mean to you, Dean? And it was a difficult one because I put the word in, but I know to every single person, masculinity is a different thing. But for me, I thought of, what if you didn't have to pretend to like certain things that other guys like? What if you didn't have to think about defending yourself against aggression? What if you didn't get automatically assumed to be the one that has to protect all the women in your life? Like, growing up in a house with just my mum and my younger sister, I was automatically the man of the house and had to look after them. That's what people would tell me when I was a little boy. And I was like, I have to look after them? It shocked me because I was a little boy. And so things like that, like this kind of sense that boys are little men. And I think often the adultification of black boys, but also of black girls presumed to be women and black boys presumed to be men. There's a lot in that, and I'm maybe not qualified to unpack it all. But for me, not being required to be masculine, just embracing all aspects of your identity, yourself, your natural way of moving and being in the world and relating to other people without kind of certain expectations placed upon you, like because of gender. And so there may be contextual things still, but gender needn't be the reason you have to do a certain sport or activity or not do or play with a certain toy. I mentioned having a Barbie doll, and that was like a big deal, like that I had this Barbie doll amongst the family. And, but it was also something my mum, wanted me to have because I wanted to have it. And so it started really young, but it carried on into my teens and even up till when I was about 30. When I decided to do drag for the first time, it was always something I'd been interested in doing, but it was maybe I thought a step too far to put on makeup and heels and a wig and all of that, because it was going to take me, I don't know, out of my comfort zone and into this unknown that what if I liked it so much that I wanted to do it all the time, and I knew it wasn't safe. It isn't safe for gender non-conforming people in this world. It isn't safe for many trans people in this world. And I was like, if I want to wear makeup all the time, am I going to be upset that I can't? And that became an issue with me after kind of starting to do drag. Like whenever I'd leave a venue, I'd take everything off beforehand or get a taxi home, because I knew on road, on public transport, it isn't going to be safe for a black gender non-conforming person, or not just because I'm black, but I've seen it, friends of mine and, strangers having comments made and threats of violence. And it's so prevalent. And that's because people are trying to police masculinity. They're saying you don't look like a man, but you should. Take that off. Why are you wearing that? Why are you wearing that makeup? Why are you wearing those clothes? Why are you wearing that wig? Like, and why is it anyone's business? Like, why is it anyone's business? And I think that is it. We police it, and that's what the requirement. Masculinity hasn't been required of them. When I wrote that in the poem, it was about that. It was about the other people's gaze and the other people's opinions. Without those, maybe masculinity, can be whatever, and it exists in people of all sexes and genders. So that is something that I'm still exploring.
This idea of strength, I think, comes up a lot when we talk about masculinity. But I think what you've helped do there in what you were saying is redefining what the word strength actually means. Because I think it's very easy to think strength means fighting or power or something like that. But I think actually what you've been through and what the journey that lots of other people have been through and accepting that is strength. I think the strength to take on drag in your 30s when you were like really reluctant to do that strength, not having to pretend to be someone that you're not, is strength. I had another guest on actually a while ago that said to him masculinity was being able to be comfortable in one's skin. And I thought that was another nice way of looking at it. So I think it's, again, as I said before, it's expanding this idea of what it means to be a man, manhood, masculinity, like however you want to say it. And I think that there are terms and phrases and descriptions like strength, leadership. There's so many other ones that actually maybe need to be looked at in a little bit more detail. I think what you've done there is just show that there are definitely more facets and other ways to look at it as well.
Yeah, because when I think of strength, I think of women first. I think of my grandmothers holding families together, coming from one country to another and building a life. I think of my mom, a single mom, working and studying and raising two kids on her own, having been kicked out by my grandfather for having a child out of wedlock and having a black child. So there is strength in also forgiveness, forgiving my granddad. When my mum forgave my grandparents and we were kind of brought back together as a family, it was the best thing she could have done. She could have held that grudge against them and I might not have had those grandparents in my life. But I think strength for me, there's so many strong women in my life that I feel that it's not the preserve of men to be the strong one.
I want to come back to this idea of identity and specifically with the poetry that you write, how that helps you explore different themes of identity and belonging, because this is another big thread that goes to a lot of the conversations that I have, particularly around men, is this this sense of identity and what it means to be a man and what is my purpose, even be going beyond what it means to be a man, like what is generally my purpose and identity in the world. How does poetry specifically help you explore those different ideas and maybe get it on paper and express it that way?
Yeah, I mean, poetry for me has been a very kind of democratic form and medium, because not just the writing of it, but going to open mic nights and sharing my work when I was younger meant I could write something that day and have it heard by a room full of people that evening, which was just mind blowing for me. This is pre putting everything on social media, but this was like in a room with people and they would listen to you and even give you feedback. But almost for me, most importantly, a round of applause. So for me, it was something to be shared and something to open dialogue, and it was also a kind of community I was becoming a part of. So there was a lot to it for me. That sense of kind of being heard, that sense of hearing others and seeing how our experiences compare and making friends and, going back to places where I felt most welcome and kind of having, those spaces where we had shared interest in as poets. And I think whatever that might be for someone else, it might be, a sport, it might be another kind of creative outlet or, a fandom or whatever. But for me, it was, poetry. And the writing of it was always kind of personal. So I wouldn't share every poem. I'd write what I needed to write and then decide after the fact, is this something I want to share? But it was just that kind of space to get my thoughts not necessarily clear, but clear up. So some of my poems might ask questions, some of my poems might answer them, some of my poems might be very defensive, and some of my poems might be very open and kind of letting people in. Yeah, so sometimes poetry was like a reaction to something that happened that day, and sometimes it was an exploration about something I was just generally curious about. So my identity shone through the kind of questions I was asking in my poems, or the kind of personal information I might be sharing, or kind of how it was addressed. And so, some of my poems, I remember one I performed a lot called Revolution Awaiting Warriors, and it was about like standing up for what you believe in and fighting for what you think of is right. And that became a poem I performed a lot when I was younger, because that was generally, where I was coming from, was like speaking up for myself and others and standing up for what I believe in. And I was very much inspired by the music of Bob Marley and the speeches of Martin Luther King and poetry by Gil Scott-Heron and Maya Angelou and Benjamin Zephaniah and John Agard. And, they were all very forthright and spoke up for themselves and their communities. And that was something I was trying to achieve in my poetry. And so that was where I found a sense of purpose. And the raw material was my life. So it was just about translating the frustrations of being, on the receiving end of homophobia or racism, or being underestimated or undermined in life, and channeling that into kind of a more defiant and rebellious and outspoken poetry. And I was seeing that, there was, even in like a very masculine genre such as like hip hop, I was seeing the vulnerability come through in some of the rappers like Tupac, when he wrote about his mom, or he also wrote poetry, or like Song Cry by Jay-Z, and like, people having both or many sides to themselves, that you can be, strong and forthright, but you can also be kind of vulnerable and loving and show your emotions. And the thing is, when I say emotions, it's like, well, anger's an emotion, but also, there's men, when we talk about emotions, we're not necessarily counting anger as one of the emotions, and so many men express their anger and don't think of themselves as emotional, which I think is a really interesting thing. But yeah, I think, the whole spectrum of emotion being available to men is really important. And I think through poetry, I gave myself the chance to write love poems, angry poems, fun poems, and just like explore what I had to say and how I could create a reaction in an audience when I was performing at open mics. And yeah, it was a real exercise in kind of self-expression and kind of giving myself that permission to take up those 3 to 5 minutes on stage and be listened to.
The great thing with your poetry, and again, it doesn't have to be poetry, it can be just like journaling, for example, is it just helps to get under the surface of, for things like identity. I think it's very easy to tie it into things like your career, for example. Like, that's something that I've done so much over my life. And then obviously the problem is, if that career gets taken away from you, well, then you sort of start to lose your sense of identity. But what you're doing, obviously, through writing and processing that way, is you're getting sort of like below the surface level stuff like that, and actually really starting to understand, and I guess put your identity to being someone rather than something, I guess, and just really looking at what makes you and shapes you. And I guess for me, and again, this is sort of true in my own journey at the moment, I've got to that stage where I am starting to write and process things now, which is helping. The bit that I'm struggling with a little bit, and I think other people will be, is what you said earlier around acceptance. So you can write this stuff down and you can read it and you can process it, but actually accepting things that have happened, things that you can't change because of the way they are. Do you have any advice on how to get to that stage of acceptance for things that you can't change?
Yeah, it's time, because when I wrote Person Unlimited, I put a lot of things in my memoir that only a handful of people knew about. But I knew when I was writing it that it was still up to me what got published. So, I tried to be really open in the first draft, and the first draft of the book is 170,000 words. The published book is 70,000 words. So there's 100,000 words that didn't get published because I decided, or my editor decided, that they were not for public consumption. And so when you're writing things down, try not to think about who the audience is. Just think about what you need to tell yourself. And it may still be that you're not ready to hear what you're telling yourself. And so the time element of it comes from, putting it away once you've written it. Like, don't say like, okay, I wrote this yesterday and now I've got to be over it. No, you wrote it yesterday. So now you've told yourself this thing. But it might take a while for you to accept that that is how you feel, or what happened, or your thoughts around that matter. And so I come back to poems months, years later, and the same with like anything I'm writing that's gonna definitely be published, like the memoir. Like it was a long, a couple years process. So it meant what seemed super raw and terrifying to tell people when I started in 2020 didn't seem as raw and terrifying by the time it got published in 2024. And so those 4 years, a lot changed. I was having therapy, which was helpful. I've been in a more stable place. I've been in my relationship now with my partner for 7 years, and a lot of what I was dealing with was around relationships, romantic and sexual relationships. So being in that safe and stable place within a relationship has kind of taught me that I am safe, and I think going from partner to partner in the past, you never got to that place of feeling completely safe. So for me, it is about like not just accepting what happened in the past, but accepting it's no longer happening. The idea of, like PTSD, it's like your body doesn't know that these are just memories. It thinks it's happening all over again. So when I wrote about sexual assault that happened to me, I ended up, because I had to describe it for the book, like I ended up feeling like I was there again. And so that's something I had to work through in therapy, was that like, I'm not there. I am no longer in that position, and and it's not happening again. And I have to kind of like remind myself, I'm here. Where are you? What can you see? Who are you with? Or like that kind of like getting into the present, being in the present. Like, yes, these things happened in the past, but you're not there now. You are here, and hopefully here is a better place for you. And if it's not, then that's what you've got to address, like getting to safety now. The present is your priority, and then the past will work itself out once you're safe in the present.
Dean, it's been a brilliant conversation, and it only feels fitting to wrap it up with a closing poem.
Yay!
You wouldn't mind maybe sharing one of your fabulous pieces just to close us off? That would be fantastic.
Absolutely. So this is a poem called Two Black Boys in Paradise. It's from my poetry collection, There Is Still Love Here, published by Nine Arches Press. And this is the poem that's been turned into a film, a short film, a stop motion animation. And that one is narrated by Jordan Stevens. But now you're going to hear the poem in my voice. Two Black Boys in Paradise. They won't be here forever. Maybe just as long as this poem. These two black boys in paradise. Two black boys. Can you see them? These two black boys are free. These two black boys are happy. Black boys are real boys. Black boys are not just little men. Do you believe black boys are real? Like, for real, for real. Real black boys feel. These two black boys are a healing. Did you poison the apple already? Did you dig up the tree? Are you trying to plant these black boys in the ground? Did you call them apple thieves? Did you call the police? There are no police in paradise. There are no white people in this paradise. The two boys in this poem have black boy names. They have grown up now, but their names still suit them. Masculinity has not been required of them. They're in love with each other, and they're in love with themselves. One kisses the other's Adam's apple. They don't make babies. Maybe paradise is just meant for two people at a time. Maybe it will be two black girls in paradise next time. Maybe they won't have to be boys or girls. Maybe it will be you in paradise, with that person you have in mind right now.
Dean, thank you so much for your time today. That's been such a vibrant and such a passionate conversation that we've had that I think has really touched on a lot of important elements. I think the biggest takeaway for me is just coming back really to the North Star of the podcast, really expanding this idea of what it means to be a man. I think that you've given some really good and important takes on how we can expand that and how we can look at things slightly differently from your lived experiences. And I think from a personal standpoint, I think one of the biggest things that I'll take away is this idea of acceptance of things that have been, and how you can start to go through that process, because whatever it is that you're going through, I think that is like a big element of coming out the other end and ultimately becoming a better and stronger person. So I think, just as you said, sort of like living in the present and being more present and not still living in things that have happened and are done is super important. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on, sharing your wonderful poetry. Part of your incredible story, I think, again, will just resonate with so many people as well. So thank you so much for sharing your time with us today.
Thanks so much for having me.